Rise and shine, campers, and welcome back to another Camp Legend Lorcana video. I'm Gibbles and Bits, and with me is Ian, and we're going to be going over some budget decks today. But first, before we get into that, I do want to reference a video that we put out last week about whether Lorcana is too expensive or not. We had some great discussion in the comments of the YouTube video. So, in response to that, we are going to be going over some decks that we think are rather affordable. We're upping our limit from what we did in the last season where we tried to make budget decks that were below $25 or less, but because of the wider card pool and just some of the more expensive cards out there nowadays, we upped the limit to $50 if we can help it on our budget deck. So we each got a couple that we're going to go through and see if you guys tell us, do you think that these decks fit the budget mold? Are they too expensive still? Or do they compete? Are they viable against some of these rather expensive competitive decks that are out there right now? I'll kick us off here with our first budget deck. This is what I'm calling unleaded fuel. People talk about all the time how aggro decks are gas or full throttle, and unleaded fuel is like the econ mode version of it's not the most expensive gas, and this is a budget version of an aggro deck. So one of the most popular color combinations, and has been for I think for each of the previous two seasons as well, is the amber amethyst color combination. Both have some high questing or just be able to go wide early strategies. And both colors got some additional help here in this. Well, more or less, I guess, on the amber side, got additional help on the aggro piece of it here. If you have a little bit more of a budget to play it, you can also add the 5-drop Kita in here. We're running the 1-drop Kita, so you can shift it in there and kind of stop your opponent from questing into you. But the budget version, we're only running the 1-drop Kita. But where the Amber package really got the additional help are some cards like Piglet Pooh Pirate Captain. So if you have 2 or more other characters in play, this character gains 2 lore, which you can game that a little bit where you drop your 3rd character and then immediately quest with Piglet. It doesn't have to be the 3rd character on board. Wendy Darling, Talented Sailor, is a 2-drop that quests for 2, and it's got 3 defense, which is great for a 2-drop. It's not too often that you get to quest so aggressively and have a decent chance of having the unit live to the next turn, where something like a Pinocchio, even though it quests for 3, it's got a 1/1. You can probably expect it's going to die unless you can protect it on the following turn. Blue von Brunwald is the new 3-drop bodyguard that we were really excited before Inklands dropped, despite it not having any attack stat and 3 defense, which isn't really that great for a 3-drop. It does have bodyguard, and when it's banished, you gain 2 lore. So even if you get a quest off of it on your turn and then your opponent kills it, well, you just got 3 lore at minimum for a 3-drop, and it protected your other units on board. This is one of in our opinion, I think you'd agree, Ian, one of the best aggressive new additions to Amber, just because it's almost kind of guaranteed. It's kind of guaranteed lore that also protects some of your early game. If you're going to run something like a Pluto as well, the 1-drop Pluto that allows you to kind of cheat out units early, you can drop this on turn 2 and still continue to protect Pluto and continue to ramp if you're going to play more of a mid-range game too. So Blue's got a lot of different uses here. Still running a lot of the Merlin package with Rabbit for card draw, Goat for additional lore. Splashing 3 of our Arthur Wizard's Apprentice in here. This is one of the high-profile cards from the Rise of the Floodborn season, and that's the big ticket item here amongst our budget within this deck is 220 a piece of the Arthurs. They can just absolutely send you to the moon with lore on turns that your opponent's not expecting it, or if they can't deal with your Arthur. Card draw here with Frenzy on the other side, and even the addition of Neverland just for some density at your 1-drop slot to make sure you get something out there on turn 1. So, Ian, any commentary on this unleaded fuel budget aggro deck?
Yeah, so I actually think that as far as budget options go, although we are not going to showcase too many other, amber aggro decks, I think Amber has a great platform for building several different aggressive shells. And so, and same with Amethyst. So putting them together makes a ton of sense. You've got on the Amethyst side all of the bouncing effects, which are just extremely versatile and strong. And then, of course, on the Amber side, you have the swarm effects where, you're getting units out, protecting them, and then you have Piglet to capitalize on having, 3+ units. I think it's a really maybe a little bit predictable, whereas like when you play against an opponent, they're going to understand what you're doing and what they need to do to stop you. But
Sure.
it can just sometimes win matchups where your opponent is not playing enough early game or doesn't draw enough early game. You can just sort of run away with the game. I think the big thing with something like this is really take the time, like don't speed through your turns. I've played against too many bounce aggro players that didn't take the time to figure out the optimal ordering of bouncing something versus playing something versus questing with something. And
Yeah,
it can be
for
easy to
sure.
mess up. So take your time when playing this, and always, always, always keep drawing cards. You have to keep the cards flowing, preserve and highly value things like Merlin Rabbits, Maleficent Sorceress, Friends on the Other Side. And what's cool is Baloo is actually a really great card to sing Friends on the Other Side with. When he dies,
Yeah, very much so.
he gets you 2 lore. He only quests for 1. So opponents that are using removal actions are often just ignoring him, which means he could just sit there and fill up your hand with more options if you have friends on the other side. I like this list a lot, and I think in terms of if you only had $50, this deck is one of the best decks to be as good as possible, as fast as possible. However, I think the downside of a deck like this or another sort of amethyst aggro shell is that it doesn't have as much upside. So like there's not a whole lot more to add to this deck to push it into that higher up echelon. And so if you only ever have $50, this is great. If you're looking for something to build off of, maybe it's not as good of an option. But yeah, great list.
Yeah, yeah. Just name of the game. Don't let your aggro decks, if you're going to play them quite often, become muscle memory, or else you'll start making mistakes.
For sure.
All right, so you've got a kind of a back-to-back list here that you want to go over. That
Yeah.
I don't know, just they're similar in structure and they kind of play off of each other from a conversation perspective. So go ahead and take us through your first deck here, Ian.
Yeah, so our first deck, and if you would just scroll down just a tiny, tiny bit so we can see the
Boop.
bottom. There we go. This is, I swear it's medicinal.
One of the
Which
best names
is,
from our episode today.
thank you, thank you. So this is leaning into Grand Pabby, the oldest and wisest. So Ruby and Sapphire have a fantastic control shell, but typically it's considered a little bit of an expensive deck to make. That being in part because you have so many legendary control tools. Maleficent Dragon is a common inclusion in a deck like this, but of course, those cost like 25 to 30 bucks.
Still expensive.
So way too expensive for something like this. So instead, what we've done is what I actually did in the last meta, in the Rise of the Floodborn meta, albeit minus a few cards that are key in here, but lean into Grand Pabby as a finisher option. So instead of controlling the game out indefinitely and trying to, slowly, grind away with units that and removal, instead you're looking to find an opportunity to get down Grand Pabby, stick it, and then do a bunch of healing through all of your items like Popsicle, Magic Golden Flower, and Gumbo Pot, all of which are very cheap items that can heal as well as be discarded for Hiram Flaversham, which of course is your card draw engine. Notably, because all of your items are most of your items are very, very cheap. Flaversham is an easy thing to set up. We also have Maurice's Workshop, a card that I added right at the end of the meta, and 2 copies of this. You don't want to run more. Really took this off in terms of consistency. Sometimes you don't find Flaversham. This is a Flaversham replacement card. And so this basically allows you to run 6 Flavershams. Really nice when you're having a density of items as much as this deck. And so between Grand Pabby having these healing opportunities, especially with things like Mother Gothel, which you often ink in the early game and you only really drop once you have a Grand Pabby ready to go. Although in certain matchups, if you know your opponent is playing an all-in aggro deck, Mother Gothel can actually be fantastic to drop because you will often have a Popsicle or a Golden Flower to immediately heal it so that you can effectively have a 2-cost 3/4 or 2-cost 3/3. So there's some great options with Mother Gothel. You, of course, have Grammatala, which I think is maybe the most cuttable card in here right now. We're not leaning as much into the Teeth and Ambitions. We only have the 2 or 3 one jump aheads. Looks like I landed on 3 here, which is a great thing to use with Grammatala. But Grammatala is specifically for the slower matchups. You want to play Grammatala when you know you're playing against a control deck or something like that. And then the coolest thing I think about this is not only do you have the Grand Pabbies, but you also have Tamatoas. So this is, $1.85. So pretty affordable for a top end threat. And with all of the items in here, you'll have plenty of options to pull back from your discard pile of things that you destroyed with Flowers from early in the game, or items that you destroyed to heal things. And it can be it's very common for Tamatoa in this specific structure to have, 4 or 5 items out at once. And because they're all so cheap, sometimes you can chain items with Maurice's Workshop in the late game to be able to ramp up. Now, if you were going to improve this, as you can see, we have used most of our budget on 3 Be Prepareds. I think that you can get away with just buying 3 if you're new to the game. Eventually, you'll stumble across a 4th that somebody wants to trade, or if you get your hand on some first chapter. 4 is better, but 3 is like doable, and you can get away with it. So I got away with 3 Be Prepareds for the longest time. You can too. I think the thing that is the biggest upgrade for this deck that isn't in here are Fishbone Quills as a replacement for Heart of Tefiti, and maybe you would want to find some other cards to cut, because Fishbone Quill is ideal in a deck like this, as opposed to Heart of Tefiti, which is a little bit slower. And then the other thing is Mauis. Mauis are fantastic as big rush bodies to swing into things like locations or things like Robin Hoods. And because they're so bulky, a lot of times they live afterwards, setting up a Grand Pabby heal chain. So anyways, those are ways you can upgrade it, but I do think this is a great basic structure for one way to play Ruby Amethyst Control. And if we can switch over to the other one, this one is more experimental. I have put less hours into this, but this is something I'm working on currently. And it is a little bit more honest, I suppose, less greedy. So instead of leaning into the heal package to close games out, instead, you can see we've diversified our top end a little bit more. We have things like Gastons. We had Madame Medusas before as well. We have Maui Whale, which I know is a very weird inclusion. But the goal here is this is a list that is more respectful of location decks, which are out there. And with how much you're able to ramp the early game, Maui Whale is a opportunity to potentially do massive board clears in the late game. And listen, I think this is probably in a non-budget deck something you cut, but it also turns on Maui's Fishhook, of which we've included 3 of instead of just the 2 of in the other one. And the goal here is to be able to chain this even when you don't have Maui out. And again, you would love to have the 5-drop Maui in here, but it's really, really pricey. And I think, again, Be Prepared is more important. But in this build, Maui's Fishhook is designed to pair along with Sumerian Talisman, is designed to pair with the combination of Motunui, Island Paradise as a location, and all of your cheap 2-drops. So your ramp package, in theory, looks something like, if you have it, a Popsicle on 1. On 2, you either play Motunui or you play one of your 2-drops, especially Hey Hey, Accidental Explorer, is a pretty compelling one. Grammatala is also pretty compelling to play on 2. And so if you play Hey Hey or Grammatala on 2, then on turn 3, you drop Motunui, you move them over for 1, and then you swing into something. Or you drop Motunui, you move them over for 1, and then you sing Teeth and Ambitions with that character if your opponent does not have something that you can attack. Similarly, if they're an aggro deck, you take a slightly different line, which is you lead Motunui on 2, and then on turn 3, you bring in a Queen of Hearts or Stitch Little Rocket, move them over, swing into something. If they live, in the case of Queen of Hearts, if Queen of Hearts lives, great. Stitch won't live. Unless it's Curse Merfolk, in which case Stitch will live. But either way, they will then immediately go into the Inkwell, and you'll be able to start ramping that way. Sumerian Talisman, again, is a increases your card draw with all of these things that as you'll be drawing these small rush units. Again, we're trying to make up for the lack of Maui. These small rush units are going to be able to feed into bigger things that your opponent has. In theory, you can buff them up with Maui's Fishhook. And then as you're feeding into them, you can draw cards when they get banished because they are little tiny chaps. So anyways, that's the concept here. Again, I think that this is stronger into aggro and maybe mid-range as well, weaker into control because you can't close the game out as fast. McDuck Manor and Motunui are kind of the ways you want to end games. McDuck Manor is in the other deck, but this one's more important because McDuck Manors are how you win games with a deck like this. You set up your locations and then you protect them as long as you can with all of your big bodies and all of your rush units. So as your opponent is bringing things out, you're trying to clear things and protect your locations as long as possible because that is going to creep you up in lore to 20. So that's the concept here. I do think this one is interesting because I try to focus these decks on if you have more Floodborn stuff, the previous deck is better. If you have more Inklands stuff, this deck is better. So if you're just entering into the game now and you've got a lot of the Inklands starter deck stuff, Hay's, Stitches, Maui's Fishhook, Heart of Tefiti, Sumerian Talisman, Motunui, McDuck Manor, that's mostly Inkland stuff, right? And then on the flip side, for the I Swear It's Medicinal, that one is a little bit heavier on the Rise of the Floodborn stuff. You've got the Nick Wilds in there. You've got the Mother Gothels. You've got the healing stuff, Gumbo Pot, Maurice's Workshop. So, I thought that might be helpful for newer players who are on a budget and either they're getting back into the game after buying a bunch of Floodborn stuff or they just started and they've got a lot of Inkland stuff. Maybe that helps them focus. So anyways, I do think the cool thing about this is that both of these provide a platform to be able to build into a very strong meta list when you're ready to invest in more cards. So I think it's a great starting point for budget decks. That's something I always think about is like, how can I take a cheap deck and then build up to a really strong one? So anyways, there you go, Gibby. I know that was a lot here, but between the two, tell me your thoughts on the two of them. I know you've played a lot of Ruby Sapphire too, so chime in. What do you think here for a budget list?
Yeah, you and I both share the opinion here that Sapphire is maybe not in the best spot right now. There are definitely some competitive decks out there that are utilizing Sapphires almost as the quote unquote secondary color within their deck. However, the thing I love about both of these versions is that it finds a way to utilize some of the things that Sapphire does the best, which is utilizing the ramping along with the strong item packages without what I would consider in a lot of the more traditional competitive decks that utilize Sapphire. Without using it in the traditional way, which is Fishbone Quill. Fishbone Quill is a very strong item that allows you to ramp rather quickly. But it is an expensive card. So you have found a way in two different versions to still kind of utilize some of the stronger points of Sapphire along with the removal of Ruby without having to break the bank into Fishbone Quill, which I think is also, to your point, a logical next step. If this is going to be a base deck for you that you're going to start out with budget-wise and you want to build upon it, something to keep an eye out for is Fishbone Quills from the first chapter, as they are a great ramping tool within the item package. Might replace something like a Maurice's Workshop or a Heart of Tefiti or something like that.
Definitely Heart of Tefiti.
Yeah. Heart of Tefiti is great and it's interesting, but I think it is a Fishbone Quill is something that's a bit more streamlined for it. I was even just considering today the Maui Whale, and I not really having an idea of how to play it. Like, I just kind of looked at this card and I was like, they had to have had an idea in mind, the developers, when they made this card about how to use it or how to make the most out of it. And it's almost one of those cards where someone somewhere is going to figure it out, and then the light bulb's going to click on for the entire player base and go, oh yeah, that card has value. And whether it becomes mainstream or not, or whether it finds its way into competitive decks, I don't know. But I like that you are thinking outside the box here and including it, either as a way to turn on your fish hook, or just the ability to kill units with rush units and gain value out of the Maui whale. So I think you are thinking outside the box here and trying to find ways to compete in all three phases with these decks, and I like that.
Well, I also just want to shout out Madame Medusa, which today crept up 14 cents. And I say that because I was building it, and it was 81 cents when I first started building it. And then when I was done building it, it jumped to 95 cents. This card is criminally low for how strong it is in the current meta. Gibby and I were like talking about this, like, maybe it probably will never pass like $2 or $3, but it is being played over Lady Tremaine in meta Ruby decks, because the biggest threats in the meta are 3 power or less, Robin Hood and Sad Beast. And so, like, I
Ursula, the 3-drop.
would snatch some up right now if you don't have them. Even if you're a budget player, just grab them, because they're going to be good. They're always going to be a meta contingent, removal option for Ruby. So I think they're really good, and you should get yourself, 3 maybe.
Get yourself some.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on here to my second deck. If you are from the early 2000s, I would say late 2000s, early 2010s, and you know this meme, shout out to you. It's Free Real Estate. This is a deck that is utilizing some of the new locations and is kind of a tempo deck, is what I'm going to consider it as. It's a deck that I built not with the budget aspect in mind even, but I just happened to look at it as we were kind of preparing for this episode and went, wow, it's right on the money when it talks about us trying to build a deck that's $50 or less. It is a little bit outside the box as well from a color combination perspective. There's a really predominant tempo deck right now utilizing amethyst and emerald and some of the Ursula package, which we are considering the Ursula Deceiver in here. The 2-drop, when you play this character, you get to look at your opponent's hand and ditch a song card out of their hand. Looking at your opponent's hand and removing a song card that you find the biggest problem to your deck is great. And the fact that this card is an uncommon is one, if you can find it, snatch it up. It'll be relevant in every single game you play, because even if you don't ditch a song, you get to look at your opponent's hand and understand what they have and maybe play around it. But we are not going to break the bank with the 3-drop Ursula that allows you to double sing songs, because that card is sitting at like $38 right now. So we're going to stay away from that. But this is absolutely a tempo deck that want to utilize some of the movement package with the locations. So we've got some interesting units here, like Peter Pan Lost Boy, where once you move this unit to a location, you gain lore equal to that location's lore count. So when we've got locations like Fang River City, Queen's Castle, that only costs 1 to move, these both would give you 2 lore immediately, and you don't have to exert the Peter Pan. This is a card that you don't see running around a lot, but I have found a lot of use for, especially as a game closer. You won't necessarily think about it because it's a 4-drop for 3 power and 3 defense, but it's a really good way to be able to gain lore on the same turn that you drop him onto the board, because you can move a character to a location even though they have the quote unquote, like, their ink is drying. You can still move them and he still gains the lore from the ability. Forbidden Mountain is just a high defense location, even though it doesn't necessarily have an ability, and Deville Manor being able to drop a location on 1 to start triggering some of your abilities on your units. We've got Stitch Covert Agent, which I think is a really interesting card from the new Inklands. I think Ian's pretty high on this card as well in certain formats. It's got evasive, and it gains ward when it's at a location. So it's untouchable and from spells, and it's got evasive to it. If I kind of at base and a quest for 2, so a pretty decent card to be able to get you some lore into the late game if you can find a way to protect it and get it over to a location for cheap. I will find my way is there's 2 main cards that allow you to kind of cheat your way. Well, I'll say 3 cards that allow you to cheat your way into locations. from the Into the Inklands set. I Will Find My Way is one of them. So you can sing it for one. Chosen character gets +2 attack, which may or may not be relevant, and then they move to a location for free. So you can drop a unit that really wants to be at a location, spend the extra 1, or sing it on the following turn and move that location over. Move that character over to a location that you really want to be at. This is really useful for something like Fang City, where it costs 2 ink in order to get a unit over to a location where they would gain the Warden evasive, so they're a lot more protected once they're there. One of the other units of the three that, other cards of the three that allows you to cheat units into locations is Magic Carpet Flying Rug. And I think this might be the card that I'm guilty the most of trying to jam into any amethyst deck that I can from Into the Inklands, just because it is evasive, which we know is great on early turns, and you move a character of yours to a location for free. Now, not every deck that you're going to run is going to run locations or the density of locations that justify Magic Carpet. But for this deck, we're running 15 locations. That's dense enough to where Magic Carpet has its uses. Yeah. Something like moving a Treasure Guardian that is only active and can challenge and quest unless it's at a location for free by just tapping Magic Carpet that you've already got on board is fantastic. We would love to do that. So this deck definitely has the density in the locations to be able to utilize something like a Magic Carpet. So we're curving out here. Our 3-drop slot is really kind of our early into the mid-game challenge slot. So whether you need to pull back a Zazu or an Ursula Deceiver to be able to cast it again, you can pull those back with Madam Mim Fox to then be able to swing into something immediately and kind of slow your opponent down. Or this is a card that came from Rise of the Floodborn, Merlin Crab. Yeah, when it comes on the board, you can give a unit +3 Challenger, and when it leaves the field of battle, you also get to give a unit +3 Challenger. We've talked about in previous videos how important it is to be able to almost trade up in a way against some of these locations, or be able to buff your attack and have some sort of mechanic in your deck to be able to challenge and clear locations quickly. I think for Amethyst, Merlin Crab has increased in value because of the addition of locations to the Into the Inkland set, where we didn't really have that need to be able to buff our attack stat in the Rise of the Floodborn meta, but now shutting down something like an opponent's Queen's Castle, where they can start drawing cards off of it, or trying to challenge a McDuck Manor is important to be able to respond to. Shenzi Hyena Pack Leader is one of our location-based card in here that gives us cards in our own hand. So while this character's at a location, you get +3 attack, and every time you challenge another character, you may draw a card. So Shenzi is going to live a couple challenges because of that 6 defense, and is great for being able to maintain card draw as you move into your mid game. So this deck is all about utilizing the locations to gain value, bouncing your units back and forth, controlling your opponent's hand, and questing hard at the locations and utilizing the locations to kind of gain that passive lore as well. I really like this deck. I think it's fun as a tempo deck, and it's an alternative to the relatively tempo style of the more competitive deck that's out there. It's a bit more song-based, running the expensive Ursula without having to break the bank. Ian, do you have any thoughts here about this? It's free real estate.
Yeah, so this is the general structure that I built a Brooms deck with, and I think that deck is pretty cool as well. I'll have to put that on the channel sometime. It has some things that it's better at than this deck, and has some things it's worse at than this deck. It definitely has way more uninkables, which is a downside. I think one of the things that this deck does that I really, really like is that it can pressure the lore through the locations, but then do a great job of protecting the locations through resilient units. I think if the opponent is using their cards to remove your units, then they're not using it to remove your locations. And so that's a really cool thing. I think if I was going to build a version, I don't think I would use the Magic Carpet. I think I Will Find My Way is a pretty strong card I found in my testing. If you're playing into the units, is it good enough to be in the best top meta decks? No, but we're not doing that. This is a budget conversation, right? So if this holds a space in a budget conversation where you are really leaning into a specific strategy, and hoping that your opponent doesn't really know how to play around it, doesn't really have the answers prepared for it, because there are a lot of odd stat blocks on our stuff that make it awkward for your opponent to do things to your cards. There's a lot of locations that a lot of decks are running like just 4 locations. Well, your opponent can have enough removal for maybe the first 2, but getting to the point where they can, unless you've already lost and they have completely flipped the board on you, getting to the place where they can remove your 5th or 6th location, that gets harder. The thing that I guess I'd say that if it was going to be make some adjustments, I love Rafiki in a list like this, especially in conjunction with Merlin Crab, which I'm glad you put in here because that card is incredible right now. And I think I'd love to see maybe some more cards designed to carry the crab buff into key stat lines. So like Rafiki with 3 attack when it attacks, a +3 that clears Robin Hoods, that clears most of the early game locations, that clears beasts. So and then the other thing that if it was me, I would slot in 2 copies of Pinocchio to tap down things like beast, and then swing at them when your opponent's not suspecting. But the general structure here, the thing I'm most excited about, and I'm about to go build this deck, I think, is Treasure Guardian. I've been looking at that card for a while, and I wanted to put it in my Brooms deck, but that was too many uninkables. So building a version of this that is not Broom focused, and leaning into the fact that you have a 4-mana 6/6, that's pretty cool. And I think too, your 4-drop slot of Treasure Guardian and Shinzi, Peter Pan is one that I'm still wrapping my head around, but Shinzi and Treasure Guardian have the ability to go, you drop them on 4, you don't need a location out. In fact, you don't want a location out when you drop them. You want to drop them, and then on turn 5, drop a new location, move them there, and get swingy, right? And so this is really different, and it makes me excited to look at it. So I think I'm gonna have to craft one of these up for playing next week. And I think the cool thing about it, though, if I can throw one more concept out here, is that the majority of your budget is being eaten up by the Queen's Castle, which is a redonkulously good card. But I think that and Mimfox. There's a world where you could potentially, as a budget player, trim those down and have a lot of wiggle room for, like, if you were to go 3 Fox, like, I don't think that would break your deck. If you were to go 3 Castle, I don't think that would break your deck. And so potentially look and see, like, okay, what else can I afford to put in here? It actually is a pretty cheap list. I don't know. I think similar to the other deck, I don't know how much like long-term competitive upside something like this could have. Maybe putting rabbits in here for just a few more uninkables helps increase your longevity in a match. But I think that this is an unexplored archetype that nobody is going to have clean answers for. And sometimes you just win games that way, where your opponent doesn't have a clean answer for something, and something that shouldn't sticks for 2 or 3 turns, and just you snowball into a win. So it's a really cool concept, and I'm getting more and more excited about going and trying this out the more we look at it. So yeah, really cool.
Absolutely. All right, let's move into your last deck here before we close out the episode.
So I'm going to preface this by saying I have done 0 testing around this concept. I just created it today. I haven't played it, but I was
it's the best way to deck build.
That's right. This is a concept I had from a budget perspective. So like, you look at green and you're like, okay, every deck would be better with Ursula. You look at steel and you're like, every deck would be better with A Whole New World, Robin Hood, Tinkerbell, Emo Beast. Like, steel is I find there's no reason to build a budget deck with steel, because you would just be strictly inferior to everything that they're doing, right? This deck is strictly inferior to a deck that added Ursulas to it. But otherwise, there's really nothing else that you'd really love to put in here. Maybe Ariels, maybe. But those are like $2 a piece. So like, if you took this up to $55, You could add some aerials in here too. So I view this as a deck. Again, I was trying to think of lists that had quality cards that are going to be good in your collection long term, which I believe this accomplishes, and has the ability to be upgraded with a few things if you wanted to push this to the next level. So the concept here is you're basically playing a song deck with Cinderella Ballroom Sensation, where Cinderella can sing all of the songs in here as early as turn 2. And all of your 1 through 3s are designed to just be tempo questers in the case of your opponent is not respecting your questing power, or in the case your opponent is contesting your board, peeling away their hand. And so this is a discard deck with Prince John. We have cut Bucky because there's not quite enough shift characters that we want to go in here. And instead, we're leaning into this short curve package, which short curve being like a term from like Hearthstone and other decks like that, where you kind of just stop at turn 5. You don't keep curving into the 6 through 8. So we've got a short curve here, and all of our cards that we've got, Cursed Merfolk, Flynn Riders, Ursula Deceivers, a lot of them discard cards from your opponent's hand passively, but then you can sing with them to discard cards from your opponent's hands actively. The challenge with a deck like this is that you may be discarding cards from your opponent's hand, but how are you removing the cards that they play onto the board? It's a challenge, which is why we're playing aggressive questers. The idea being we want to run the opponent out of gas and then be able to quest in their face while they scramble to adjust. So, Merfolks, Cusco's, Flynn Riders, all of those things have phenomenal questing power. And then, of course, we have discard effects from things like Daisy Duck. We have ways to bounce cards back to the hand to slow the game down or slow the opponents down from a tempo perspective with Cloud Kicker and Mother Knows Best. And then we basically have a bunch of cheap songs to find specific tools. I think Be Our Guest is like probably, again, no testing, but I think Be Our Guest is probably going to be a really interesting card in here for the ability to go find like Shift Flynn's on a key turn, or go find Cloud Kicker to bounce a key, 2 power, or, whatever. And then we basically use things like Daisy Duck, Cusco, and Flynn to close the game. Prince John is there for resource extension when we're discarding cards, but it's weird, right? Because it feels like it wants to win around turn 6, 7, as opposed to like an aggro deck that wants to win around turn it will probably win around turn 4, 5, realistically, an aggro deck, but it will have determined whether it wins or loses by that point. And with a deck like this, I think we're trying to decide what we need to do based on what the opponent's doing. And so certain matchups, you might just, hit the gas and play out all of your high questers and, turn them to the side and quest, right? And then against other decks, there's a lot of decks out there, especially these steel decks. They're very vulnerable to discard. And so that's the concept I sort of went with here.
Yeah, discard's a facet of the game that everyone understands is there, but there's really no point in game planning for it, right? Like you're always going to want some sort of, I think at this point, you're going to want some sort of card draw in your hand or some sort of card draw in your deck to be able to give yourself some hand density. But that's not really it's not really a thing you build around with the intention of countering discard. It's almost just I've got my deck, and if I run into discard, we're going to deal with it the best way that we can. So discard itself is almost like this nuanced style of play that you're trying to figure out as a discard deck how to best deal with everybody else, but they're never preparing for you. Mm-hmm. And this is really leaning into the song piece of the discard package, where you still have tools out there that are not song based, like You Have Forgotten Me or Hypnotize, or leaning into the Bucky package with more of the Floodborne stuff. Like a lot of discard decks or even just tempo emerald decks usually curve out at the top end at 6, utilizing the genie, the evasive genie that allows you to bounce something back to hand because it is such a powerful effect. You have that on Mother Knows Best, and you have that on Genie. But if you're going to, as you mentioned, short curve it and lean a little heavier on the front, then you don't have that late game option, but you're kind of putting your eggs all in one basket with the discard of being able to say I'm going to get more value out of my discard and go wider than you can if you like if your opponent misses turn 1, then you have a really strong shot of being able to put enough things on board and get discards off and sing things for free that they just can't catch up to you, because odds are whatever they're holding in their hand that they couldn't play in their early turns, you're going to have out of their hand before they can play it, especially if they end up bricking their hand or having any sort of balance of inkable to uninkables within their hand that is unfortunate. So
Yeah.
This deck preys on bad draws and slow starts, and
Yeah.
I like discard, and I prefer to play discard with the amber package than the emerald steel, but that's just my preferred play style, especially with the cards from the new Inklands. The bare necessities is maybe one of the most brutal cards to come out from the Into the Inklands set.
Yeah.
Revealing and discarding a non-character card of your choice versus the Ursula that discards specifically a song. So running them both is just fuel to the fire for absolutely obliterating your opponent's hand and all of their good cards. If your opponent wants to run expensive cards and try to hurt you with their money, this is the best way to turn that back in their face and say, no, you're not. And
Yeah.
just ditch the expensive cards. Make it feel bad.
Yeah. So the thing about this this deck is, again, it's entirely unoptimized. Sorry, I didn't do the homework for you. I feel like the other two, the Sapphire Ruby decks, I'm pretty certain they're like pretty close, right? This deck, again, sort of incepted in my brain this morning. And so, sure, we might like decide we want to add some genies to it. Now, it's a lot of uninkables. Where are we going to cut some things, right? We might decide Lucifer. Lucifer almost made the cut, and then at the last minute, I said, you know what? Let's put Kuzco's in as a way to close games faster, right? The other thing I'll throw out there is, so to be clear, similar to the other decks, like the Ruby Sapphire one I built, I wanted to have cards in the list that are worth getting and adding to your collection for the future, right? So things like the Flynns, all of the Flynns, especially the 1 and 2, weirdly more so maybe than the 4, but the 1 and 2 are really, really good and are going to be in a bunch of different Emerald decks, in and out of a bunch of different Emerald decks, right? Cloud Kicker, cheap, common card, great card, really strong, big winner from the set, right? Prince John, if you ever want to play a discard deck, Prince John is a strong contender to be in it for the end of time, right? And then similarly with a lot of the songs, these are easy to find cards that you'll be able to put in there, probably from everything except bare necessities you can find in a commons box, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, for the big sort of money card, Cursed Merfolk and Cinderella are both powerhouse one drops that are going to be in the format and are going to be in meta lists for a very long time. So why not grab them now? And then if you decide you want to pivot into something else that uses them, you already have those cards. Everything else in here is dirt cheap, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the concept I went with as far as budget. I always want to tell budget players advice that will help them convert into a less budget friendly collection, right? That we want to, like, there's some things that you could tell somebody that would be like, here, go buy this stuff to be as cheap as possible, but it's not actually going to help them build their collection and get to that next level. So that's kind of where I went with this. I also want to throw out one thing here, which is that I think that, as you can see, it's mostly green. You could take all of the amber stuff out, put it in ruby, and put a few more evasives in, right? You could take all that stuff out, put an amethyst, and put some more card draw in. You could, so like, it's actually really modular. So try out, if you do decide to put together some discard decks, there's a lot of ways you can play it, but almost all of the cards that are discard focused are really, really cheap right now, because I don't think anybody has figured out how to take discard from, B tier, B to C tier, all the way up to like S tier. But this is a deck that, to Gibby's point, you will sometimes win games because your opponent can do nothing, And so I view budget decks as what is the shortcut to relevancy, right? How can I get to the place where I'm winning games against good players fastest? And I think this shell is one of the ways to do it. I think weirdly, and some people might disagree, but the hallmark of a good trading card game is ways for less skilled players or newer players or players with less budget to be able to beat higher skilled players or players with higher budgets. And I think discard is one of the best equalizers for both skill and budget. So a lot to explore in that realm.
Well, there you have it. Our first iteration of budget decks from the Into the Inklands set. We will be doing several more rounds of this as we continue to move our way through the meta, and the meta shifts into the Inklands set. If you haven't already, come and follow us on Discord for our Camp Legend Discord, where we are chatting Lorcana and all sorts of other different digital card games. Come visit us on YouTube and like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And check out our starter set, where we're going over a different digital card game every month. We just wrapped up Fights in Tight Spaces in February, and we are now moving into the Star Wars TCG in the month of March. So come check out those videos, and we'll see you on the next one.